So in today's video of, hey, that's not a Sony camera, I actually have this guy. Not the Blackmagic Pixis, but the Canon C80. This is one of the new additions to their new Canon cinema line. Believe it or not, before I started shooting the FX6, the FX3, and all the other things Sony, I actually had the Canon C70 before that upgrade with a lot of improvements. This actually has a lot of those improvements and actually adds a bunch of really useful things as well. In fact, I kind of feel like this is Canon's take on the Sony FX6. In a lot of ways, it does resemble it. But I have been able to test this out for a couple days, and I get it for a couple of weeks. But I wanted to make a video about my first impressions from somebody that shoots a lot more FX6 stuff than I do on anything on the Canon platform. We'll get there. Now, starting off with some body shaming, we're gonna go into the actual shape and form factor of the Canon C80 versus the Canon C70 that came out 4 years ago. Now, it's actually functionally kind of the same thing. I feel like in order to save a little bit of money when we talk about the price, they kind of kept a lot of the things very similar. But there are two distinct differences that are super welcome. For one, they finally put an SDI port in here. It's kind of a weird place to put it, but they do have an SDI port nonetheless. And what's super nice about that is that because it's so close to the top of the camera, putting on a monitor that uses SDI, you could use a shorter cable. And also, this is full frame now. The Canon C70 was a Super 35 camera that worked with the RF mount. But if you did want the full frame field of view and you did want a little bit more light, you did have the option of getting a $600 speed booster adapter. However, the speed booster adapter only worked on EF lenses, which kind of defeated the purpose a little bit. But now they put a full frame sensor on the Canon C80. So all of that RF glass that you purchase, which the majority of it is full frame, well, you could use it on this guy. You don't have to worry about anything else. Now, an anecdote, but another thing that's new is going to be the top handle that comes with the C70. The only thing I can say about this is that it exists. Generally speaking, top handles that come stock with your camera generally aren't the greatest things in the world, and you are going to have to rig this thing out if you really want to get accessories on there. This guy is kind of nice if you want to use it for handheld. They did make a little bit of an improvement, but there isn't any mounting points on there other than the cold shoe, so we are going to have to rig up this camera. Now, for the majority and the rest of this first impressions video, we actually did use the mid-49 cage and a lot of the accessories for it, as well as a Condor Blue battery plate. Now, myself and a lot of Canon C70 owners did have a problem with the screen. The hinge felt a little bit weak a lot of the time, and over time what ended up happening is it felt a little bit loose, and for some people the screen completely fell off. Now, there aren't a lot of improvements that I immediately see from the screen from one camera to the other. Then again, I haven't had a C70 in like 4 years, but this one feels a lot more sturdy. I did hear that they did reinforce the hinges on the screen, which is an improvement in terms of its quality control, and as well as not getting a lot of Canon users angry. So that's a fun fact. If you're somebody that's coming from the C70 and you're considering upgrading, that whole screen issue that a lot of people had, so far in the last couple of days of me using this, I haven't had that problem just yet. But if I drop it a couple times, we'll check back and I'll let you know. Now, I'm a big fan of using V-mount batteries in my setup, typically because with cinema cameras, I tend to rig them out. However, if you do want to use this as a compact setup within itself, you can use these BPU batteries for the Canon C80. They do have a ton of juice in them. I did get about 2 hours in each one. So if I keep 2 and I don't necessarily want to rig up my camera because this does kind of feel like using a 1DX Mark III with extra steps, well, you could always do that and you have enough battery life, especially if you have 2 or 3 batteries in your kit. Now that we're done the body naming or the body shaming, we're going to talk about some of the things in terms of operating this camera, particularly when you're talking about the menus. Now, the menus on the Canon C80 are kind of like the FX6, and they're interchangeable if you're not used to either system. There's going to be a ton of different things, but what I do like is that the screen is a touchscreen, so you don't have to scroll through the wheel to find the things you're looking for. You can just touch and tap in order to change the different settings. There is one thing that I might have a little bit of a gripe about in my first impressions, and this might be coming from a Sony FX6 or an FX3, where the codecs and the different flavors of your recording is going to be pretty straightforward. However, on this guy, it's a little bit confusing. There are 5 different codecs, not including the RAW, but then you get RAW, ST, and LT if you're in Super 35 mode. Then there's also bitrate options for each one, and there's 3 for each of those, so there's like 25 different things and different combinations that you can shoot on the Canon C80, and sometimes it becomes a little bit confusing because as somebody that doesn't necessarily know a lot about the Canon C80, not using it for a long time, finding the codec that's going to work for you, especially when there's 2 different types of XAVC SY something codecs, it can get a little bit confusing for your first time. Now, that's for my impression coming from the FX6, where things are a little bit more straightforward. If I want to shoot in all intra, well, you just shoot in all intra. If you want to shoot in that long op 8-bit, I hate the long op 8-bit, but at least it's pretty easy to figure out. If I want to shoot in RAW, I know I have to have an Atomos Ninja 5, and I can pick the HDMI or the SDI. It's pretty straightforward and easier to figure out. Where on this guy, you might have to spend some time figuring out what works for you. Now, just for reference, if you guys are wondering what lenses I'm going to be using on the Canon C80, for the majority of the testing outside of autofocus, I am going to be using DZO Vespid primes. I don't own RF lenses, which is another thing coming from the Sony system that I didn't get the liberty of having. But for the most part, we're still going to be able to judge our image quality, highlight roll-off, built-in NDs, all that other stuff. And let's still see if Canon still got it in terms of color science. Let's just roll the montage of all the footage we got. Getting test shoots on the C80. And my first impressions in terms of the image quality is, well, I don't have any notes. Canon's always had great image quality, and even better yet, they've always had great color science. The fact that you get a good out-of-the-box image, even in Rec 709, does say a lot to Canon's way of actually producing an image. It also does make it a lot easier if you want to grade things. Now, I am going to show you a couple clips in Rec 709, but I'm also going to show you some of the color grading that I did, and regardless of which one you want to go to, maybe you need fast delivery, or maybe you want to give your own look to it, keeping RAW aside, you still are able to get something very good out of the Canon C80. Now, speaking of RAW, you are able to use the RAW LT on the Canon C80. If you want to use ST, you have to go down to Super 35, which I didn't do in this video in particular. Maybe I'll do it in some other ones. But in terms of that 12-bit RAW instead of the normal 10-bit codec, you're not really going to get a lot on the back end. RAW is essentially made to give you a lot of flexibility in post. So everything before the end user, you guys see it, that's where you're going to be able to see a bit of that difference. Now, what's a little bit confusing is some of the frame rates and the different shooting modes that you need on this guy. Now, in 6K, you can only shoot up to 30 frames a second, and you only have the option of RAW. Now, you can shoot in 4K 120 frames a second, but there's two different codecs you need to use for each one. If I want to use the XAVCS, and I'm probably going to get this name wrong, I'll put it right on the screen, you can get up to 60 frames a second at a higher bit rate. If you want to use the HEVC or the H.265 codec, you can get up to 120 frames a second, both of which you can do in 10-bit, but you do have to switch them back and forth, which becomes a little bit confusing. One thing that I realized, especially with the playback, speaking of footage with this camera, is that each one of those shooting modes has a different folder on the camera itself. So there might be a situation where you record on RAW, and then you use the XAVC and then the HEVC, and they're gonna have 3 different file folders, which if you're a first-time user, you might not know that, and you might accidentally format your card with stuff still on it. Speaking of the cards, you can only record in SD cards, which for me personally isn't a big deal. The speeds aren't that bad. However, I kind of wish you could use CF Express Type B. However, because I only have one V90 card, you only get about 30 minutes when you're trying to shoot in that 6K RAW format. So you're going to need either extra cards or just bigger cards in general. As well as if you want to shoot in the highest bit depth in terms of the XAVC, in all-I, you also only get about like 34 minutes. So some of the files are going to be data intensive if you want to use this camera to the maximum capacity, but obviously with using a higher quality footage, you're going to need higher quality and bigger cards. Now, don't forget, this is still a Canon cinema camera, so you are still going to be able to get built-in NDs. Now, these are mechanical NDs. I'm used to using the electronic ones on the FX6 camera, but they're actually pretty nice because you do get a couple more stops. Now, there are some people that might have problem with mechanical built NDs because sometimes they might get stuck, but overall, in terms of a run-and-gun camera for documentary shoots when things are overexposed or just situations where you need to use ND and keep your settings the same, you get up to 10 stops of ND and 2-stop increments on the C80. If you guys know how to go into 1-stop, leave it down below, but for the most part, when I was using this for this test, I used 2 stops all the way through, and I do like the fact that you can go from all the way from 0 all the way through 10, and it's pretty easy to do. There's buttons on the side. Now, while using cinema cameras over the last little bit, one thing I kind of stopped caring about a little bit, especially using cinema lenses, is, well, autofocus. Now, my previous time on the Canon C70, when I had that a few years ago, one thing that Canon was not great at doing across the entire board is I couldn't do autofocus on black people. There, I said it. Whenever I use autofocus on particularly dark-skinned people, it never seemed to work quite right. It got on my nerves quite a bit because most of the clients I work with are magnificently melanated like myself. The Canon C80, a little bit different. We did do 3 different autofocusing tests with 3 different skin tones, and it actually checked out and worked really well for all 3 of them. Now we did shoot this using a 70-200 and we shot at 70mm, but regardless, getting autofocus in every type of skin tone is something that's very valuable. If you've had a Canon camera with autofocus, you might find that if you're working with darker skinned individuals, sometimes the autofocus doesn't work, which also means that it sometimes doesn't work in low light, which is just a weird coincidence and irony, but the C80 actually works really well. Now, there's very few cameras that have global shutter, and most people are going to ask, well, what's the shutter readout? I'm going to be quite honest with you. I don't know, and I kind of don't care. But what I want to do is functionally, how does it work? If I do the whip panning thing and I check the lines, if they bend, they kind of do, but at the same time, I kind of feel like rolling shutter is one of those things where if you know that you need a global shutter camera, there's a big red elephant over at the Nikon office that you can get. But in terms of shooting motion, in terms of shooting handheld, which I did a little bit while using the C80, I didn't find the rolling shutter to be bothersome. In most situations, you're going to be able to get away with rolling shutter up to the quite high mark. And the Sony Bronto could exist and be used to make really great projects, and everyone's buying their Pixis now while I'm still waiting for mine. I think the rolling shutter might be less on the C80 than one of those 2 cameras, but if it's not, it's livable and it hasn't bothered me too much. So in terms of my personal experience, my first impressions, especially as a Sony user, I haven't really noticed a gigantic difference. There is some rolling shutter. If I have the right answer, I'll put it on the screen, but for the most part, it doesn't bug me too much. Now, difference in the image between the Canon C80 and the Canon C70 is going to be that missing DJO sensor. Essentially what it does is gives you a little bit more dynamic range, which is very helpful, especially in those high dynamic situations. Now, this kind of sounds like a broken record, but I didn't necessarily a detriment in terms of the dynamic range that I found on the C80 versus what I would remember from the C70, albeit that was like 4 years ago. Generally speaking, for myself, I tend to light my scenes properly to make sure that things go the best that they can. If I'm setting up a scene beside a big bright window in the middle of the day, I'll try my best to expose for those highlights on the outside and use a big bright light on the inside. Now, in this shot in particular, I only had my 500 watt light, so in other situations, I probably would have a better light in order to overpower the sun. However, the dynamic range in this shot is actually quite usable with having a bright window in the background. It's not entirely blown out. You can still see some details from outside of the window. Is it completely perfect or anywhere close to like an RE camera? Absolutely not. Would I get a little bit more on the C70 in terms of that DJO sensor? Probably. But at the same time, there is a bunch of things that you're going to have different on the C80 versus the C70, which I don't have both to compare to, which you kind of have to make the decision of whether or not you need to get that extra, maybe a half a stop or maybe a stop of dynamic range, or you're willing to live with having all the bells and whistles the C80 has versus the C70. If I ever get my hands on both cameras, although I do have to give one of these back, I'll make a video on it. But for the most part, in terms of dynamic range and what I was shooting with, it actually was pretty decent. If not, dare I say it was pretty good. And last but not least, we're going to talk about that low light, or the triple base ISO more rather. Now, personally for me, I still stand by the idea that if you can't control it, then control your lights. You don't necessarily want to shoot in no light, because low light isn't no light. So I lit AC and I tried 3 base ISOs. It was a little bit darker and a little bit moody, and I tried 800, 3200, and 12,800. And what I found was that, well, exactly what I thought it would be. As you still go up in your ISOs, it is relatively clean, probably compared to other Canon cameras, but it's not as clean at 800 at 32 or as clean at 12,800 as you would at the regular 800. This is kind of the same thing as the FX6. It's still a relatively clean image. However, if you're comparing base to base, the higher ones are going to be noisier, especially in some of those darker areas. Now, the 12,800 and that triple base in the high end is still quite usable. All you have to do is use a bit of denoiser, which comes in DaVinci Resolve, which is kind of nice. And the same is to be said about 3200. It's just less than the 12,800, but it's definitely more noisy than the 800. Okay, so some final thoughts here, mostly because this is still a first impressions video. This isn't necessarily a full review because I don't have this guy for a long time. But as someone who's used a lot of the Sony FX platform, what do I think about the C80? I do think that if you're somebody that is an already existing Canon user, maybe you have the C70, or maybe you're upgrading to a cinema camera from the Canon system, I think Canon knocked it out of the park with the C80. Its price is incredibly competitive at $5,500, which is still surprising for Canon as they do have more expensive stuff. The image quality looks amazing. I don't have any complaints. I don't really have any notes there. And if you have any complaints about the image coming out of this camera, even if you rent it out for yourself, I don't know how to help you. You're gonna spend a lot more money if you want something better. It is nice that it has things like a triple base ISO in those pinch situations. You also get anamorphic support, which we'll talk about a bit later once I get anamorphic lenses. Everything that you want from an image perspective in the Canon C80 for the price point that it is a great value pick, even compared to the Sony FX6, which we will probably do in another video somewhere down the line. Now, all that glitters is not gold. I do love the image coming out of the C80, but there are a couple of things that I might have gripes with, but that also probably is just my own personal experience. For example, I don't like how tall this thing is. Now, I did get a cage and a rig setup from Condor Blue and Mid 49 for this shoot and for these first impression videos, but one of the things that kind of got on my nerves was how tall this camera is. I am very used to the FX6 style of body, or even using something like that Blackmagic Pixis that's going to come out in a little bit. But when working with a camera that's a little bit taller versus a little bit longer, it just feels a bit more cumbersome. Now, that's not to say that's going to be everybody's experience. Some people actually kind of like the taller body. Looking at Griffin Conway again. The image quality is going to be great, but the form factor just wasn't for me, which is kind of what prompted me to switch to the FX line in general, outside of just getting peer pressured by Mark Bone. Another thing, and this is actually something which I didn't think was a gigantic deal until I actually needed to use it, was the SD card thing. I kind of wish this did have CF Express Type B cards. I probably would have used some of the ones I had in order to store a lot more information, a lot more footage, over shooting in over 5 locations in 24 hours with 3 different talent. I kind of didn't want to have to do backups over and over again. Also, SD cards, no matter which way you go, sometimes they're a little bit flimsy. They're a little bit easier to break than some of the CF Express cards. So in terms of being a sturdy memory source, if I was to pick anything, I'd rather have CF Express platform A or B versus using SD cards. Overall, I'm going to try to get out of here and leave you with some thoughts. The Canon C80 has an amazing image quality. Its form factor is a little bit different. If you don't like it, well, to each their own. It might not be your cup of tea. However, if that's something that doesn't bother you, you're going to get a great package, amazing image quality, a lot of things that you wanted from the C70 that's now in this camera, and you don't have to worry about using speed boosters and EF lenses anymore, mostly because Canon doesn't support them. And as somebody that's used the FX6, if I was someone that wasn't working in a Sony ecosystem with other people and other production companies, I probably would have picked up a fleet of these guys and used them if I'm running my own thing with multiple cameras. However, I'm still somebody that freelances quite a bit, and Sony makes the most amount of sense because it matches up with everybody else that I'm working with. There are going to be a couple more videos with me using the Canon C80. I have a trip to Utah. I'm going to drive to Buffalo for absolutely no good reason. There's one mini doc and one commercial that's on this guy, so if you want to see more about the C80 for the short time that I have it, subscribe or do the thing that YouTubers ask you to do. That being said, there's more videos coming out, particularly in the next 24 hours. But in the meantime, YouTube wants you to watch this one. Peace.